The Xbox Series S is on paper every bit as feature-rich as the Series X. It's based on the same fundamental RAM, storage, CPU, and GPU technologies, which of course means that it is ray tracing capable. You can absolutely get RT acceleration on the system, just like any other RDNA 2 based hardware platform. In practice, it's a bit more complicated. The Series S has a modest 4 teraflop GPU paired with a meager 10 GB of RAM, which makes it challenging to implement complex ray tracing effects on the console. Most recent games lack ray tracing on the Series S, even if they pack one or more effects on Series X and PS5. Series S ray tracing titles are very scarce, even 2 years in. By my count, there are just 15 full games that use hardware or software ray tracing techniques on the platform, excluding effects that are solely traced within screen space, like the screen space global illumination in Gears 5. So let's take a look at those games, see how well those techniques translate to Microsoft's low-power console, and try to sketch out the future of ray tracing on Series S. To keep things simple, we're going to split the games today into a few different groups. Our first collection includes the most impressive uses of ray tracing on Series S by far. These are the small handful of ray tracing titles that really leverage current gen tech to deliver high-end RTGI and other RT features on the S. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition is the standout example here. The per-pixel RTGI is very high quality, realistically shading scenes and ensuring that everything looks grounded and correct within the game world. There's a consistency to the lighting that really impresses here, and is a cut above most titles that rely on pre-calculated solutions. Dynamic objects like characters particularly impress, with rich and grounded lighting. Stacked up against its last-gen predecessor, the improvements are hugely obvious. Metro Exodus used a real-time lighting system in prior console versions as well, although the hardware wasn't capable of handing in anything more than a relatively basic GI pass. RTGI is totally transformative to the general look of the game. Compromises don't particularly stick out, though if I had to nitpick, there is some fairly obvious ray tracing noise in darker spots if you do look closely. RTGI actually scales pretty nicely to lower power platforms, as you don't really need that much resolution to produce a good looking stable effect. That means that the ray tracing on Series X doesn't actually look that much more refined here, even though technically its RTGI pass is operating at several times the resolution of the Series S. There is a small reduction in visual artifacts and noise, but even that is a pretty minor difference. The RTGI train continues rolling with Fortnite. Late last year, Epic's Battle Royale title was updated with Unreal Engine 5.1, and along with it came big upgrades to assets, foliage, and of course the addition of ray tracing. On Series S, we're getting support for Software Lumen RTGI, an RT solution that combines SDF-based ray tracing alongside a screen space GI technique to produce convincing real-time indirect lighting. In practice, it looks excellent. Every area is smoothly and richly lit, which stands out in crevices and in interior spaces. The colorful world of Fortnite produces a lot of interesting lighting scenarios, so the RTGI has a bit of a heightened but very pleasing look. The primary compromise inherent to Series S again comes down to resolution. Lumen's software RTGI targets just 1/16th resolution on current-gen consoles, which doesn't seem like it would play very well with Series S and its 720p class rendered targets. But again, RTGI looks solid even at cutback pixel counts, and the lighting still feels accurate enough to produce a good result on Series S. Denoising can only do so much here though, so splotchy noise patterns are a common sight in darker areas that rely on indirect lighting. Plus the RT reflections that are present on other current-gen platforms are gone, replaced with a less stable though still good-looking screen space technique. Series S does manage to acquit itself quite well here in general though, producing a hugely satisfying RT implementation. Unreal Engine 5 got its first outing on consoles in the stunning The Matrix Awakens sample released in late 2021. This is really more of a demonstration, not a full game, consisting of a roughly 8-minute long cinematic sequence and an explorable open-world city area, though the final results are just too good to exclude from this rundown. Series S gets the full ray tracing treatment. Hardware-based RTGI, plus ray-traced reflections, as well as RT shadows in select moments. The final visual results look incredible, particularly in the opening cutscene segment, which should be abundantly clear to anyone who's seen it. but the consistency and quality of the ray tracing is made clear once you have full control in the open world. RTGI lends the game stable, true-to-life lighting even on character models and in tough spots, like the underside of bridges. It's a bit subtler than something like Fortnite, but it's still very effective. Reflections look great as well, adding detailed, perspective-correct reflections that would be very challenging to represent in real time using other techniques. Series S takes a bit of a step back from the other console versions again here, though there aren't any obvious feature cuts. RTGI quality is somewhat lower, though it's not too noticeable. Noise isn't too much of a distraction, though the RT becomes more detailed as you approach, and you can sort of break it momentarily by closing in at speed, though this is also apparent on other console platforms. The reflections are more visibly downgraded. Stacked up against Series X, the game representation in the BVH is scaled back a bit with simplified textures and models. It only really stands out on close inspection though, and only when screen space information is absent. Diffused surfaces show a more meaningful quality hit, with a messy and somewhat unstable resolve, though these are mostly based on screen space reflections, so the RT isn't as much to blame. That rounds out the top of the line ray tracing titles on Series S. So let's move on to our next grouping. It might come as a bit of a surprise, but I've chosen to group all of the current gen Resident Evil games into their own category here, which is a reflection of their prominence when it comes to RT titles on Series S. These 4 games, Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake, and Resident Evil 7 and 8, all pack very similar ray tracing tech courtesy of the aptly named RE engine. Essentially, these games offer RT reflections, plus a limited form of RTGI, which essentially solves certain lighting errors and issues present in the pre-existing baked GI solution without fully replacing it. Reflection quality varies quite a bit depending on the circumstance. Well-lit outdoor areas expose the simplicity of the BVH and can look significantly worse than the screen space reflection and cube map techniques that are otherwise used, but indoor spaces often look reasonably good. The third-person Resident Evil remakes make better use of the reflections in my view, with their artificial city-type environments. RT resolution is quite low and suffers from a lot of noise across all titles, however, so the results can look a bit messy. The RTGI produces more subtle but appreciated improvements to lighting accuracy. Some of the light bleed that is present using rasterized lighting has been fixed, and light does have more realistic propagation through certain scenes. This is mostly evident on smaller bits of geometry which can otherwise lack accurate bounce or exhibit odd shading. Series S handles the ray tracing quite effectively in my view, taking a moderate hit to reflections quality relative to the premium consoles, but otherwise managing to look pleasing enough. This does have some serious performance implications unfortunately, though we'll touch on this later. Our third grouping consists of Unreal Engine 4 titles. UE4 has fairly easy to implement RT features, which means that quite a few titles that are based on the last-gen Unreal Engine tech use ray tracing on consoles. The vast majority of these drop ray tracing on Series S, but there are a few exceptions. The first Hellblade game got an RT enhancement back in 2021 that did extend the RT olive branch to the Series S release as well. The ray traced reflections here do look quite detailed and present clean edges free of screen space artifacts. The primary issue is that Hellblade makes heavy use of fog and volumetric lighting, which doesn't seem to get any sort of approximation within the BVH. This means that the screen space reflections actually look significantly more accurate a lot of the time. Series X suffers from the same issues here, producing a bit of a mixed result for the ray tracing. Obviously, the SSR can be occluded if the camera is positioned at an acute angle, but the rest of the time the screen space results often look comparable or better. Deliver Us the Moon also suffers from an unsatisfying RT implementation in my view. This astronautical puzzle game uses RT shadows on console in a hybrid implementation that blends ray tracing based shadows with traditional shadow maps and baked shadows. The RT shadows do look interesting and are clean and detailed in a way that would be very challenging to represent with typical shadow map techniques in real time, but actual shadows in a lot of the lighting situations in the game should look more diffuse, like when cast from a close light source or a scattered source like an atmosphere diffused sun. These sort of stencil-style RT shadows are relatively cheap and do add nice bits of shadow coverage for some smaller objects, but I mostly prefer the traditional shadow techniques. Plus, there seems to be a bug where character shadows are essentially not cast at all with RT turned on, which looks quite ugly. The developer did report that RT reflections are present on current-gen consoles as well, but I couldn't find any evidence of this in my testing on either Series S or X. Little Nightmares 2 has a nice bit of ray tracing, although it's fairly subtle. Across both visual modes, RT reflections do seem to be enabled. The quality of these reflections does seem to take a big hit in the performance mode, but neither of the two options has visible disocclusion artifacting in the reflection itself, indicating that an RT technique is in play. The initial Xbox Series version of the game only featured SSR, but RT seems to have been patched in subsequently. This particular game uses reflections somewhat sparingly, however, and features relatively few glossy surfaces. I actually had to play about halfway through to work out if RT features were enabled at all, as they're practically non-existent until the hospital level. And the camera has a semi-fixed perspective, which would minimize typical SSR issues, and makes the RT a bit less of a standout here than in other titles. Observer System Redux also sports RT reflections on Series S, though they only seem to apply to very glossy surfaces. Scene coverage isn't great, though the occasional RT highlights do add to the presentation, and you're still getting 60 FPS gameplay here as well. The final grouping consists of unique titles that have odd or novel RT implementations. Crysis Remastered leads this pack, with a software-based spin on RT reflections that actually debuted first on last-gen consoles. The ray tracing looks decent in stills here, although it does take a second or two to cohere after movement. Both RT range and coverage are pretty limited, but the results are surprisingly strong for a software-based implementation of ray-traced reflections. The two most recent Formula 1 racing games, F1 2021 and 2022, also have ray-tracing features. RT shadows and reflections are present in both titles, but only in the pre-race warm-up segments and in the My Place feature in F1 2022. During the actual gameplay, there's zero RT whatsoever. Forza Horizon 5, in a similar vein, has ray tracing features in select moments. By entering the Forza Vista car viewer in the game's quality mode, you can see accurate RT reflections across car bodies. The results are excellent, although unfortunately these RT reflections don't extend to gameplay, which relies on a real-time cube map solution for vehicle reflections. Finally, we have Watch Dogs Legion, which features a graphical option to enable RT reflections. This is actually one of the stronger RT implementations on Series S, with accurate reflections added to glossy surfaces. There are a few obvious quality compromises. The reflections do suffer from quite a bit of ghosting and aliasing, which is particularly noticeable on car bodies. Plus, the RT falls back to a cube map-based solution for distant detail. In general, though, the coverage is pretty solid, and it does make a big difference when traversing the game's city streets. Ray tracing is a very demanding process. Actual ray tracing calculations tax hardware quite a bit, which on the RDNA 2 based consoles is tied to the performance of general GPU compute. That is obviously a big factor on more limited hardware platforms like the Series S, but the greater issue is the lack of RAM on the system. With 10GB of RAM, of which around 8GB is available for developers, there's little room to store the complicated acceleration structures that make real-time ray tracing possible in the first place. BVHs can take up a lot of area in memory, which the Series S doesn't have room to spare in a lot of cases. Ultimately, that means that most games that I found that support ray tracing simply don't have the feature on Series S. Titles like Control, Cyberpunk 2077, Dying Light 2, Doom Eternal, Grand Theft Auto 5, Black Ops Cold War, and Guardians of the Galaxy don't feature ray tracing on Series S, unlike Series X and PS5. After a pretty thorough search, I could only identify 15 titles that currently use proper RT on the Series S, though I could be missing a few obscure titles. Ray tracing is a relative rarity on Microsoft's junior current-gen machine, with just a few standout titles making effective uses of RT techniques. And the games that do manage to have RT are often best enjoyed without it. The 30fps 60fps split for RT and fully rasterized modes is very typical on the Series S, which I personally tend to resolve in favor of the 60fps option. The Resident Evil titles suffer particularly from this issue, with a wobbly 30 to 40 FPS frame rate in their ray tracing modes. There are exceptions, of course, like the brilliant-looking Matrix Awakens or the 60 FPS targeting Metro Exodus, but it's often a better choice to enjoy lower input lag and more fluid animation over an implementation of ray tracing that usually doesn't bring a transformative improvement to the presentation. Perhaps this will change in the future. Some ray tracing techniques, particularly RTGI, require a lot of work to use alongside a non-ray traced fallback for higher performance modes, or for weaker hardware. If a title is designed around RTGI, then the developer may simply have to find a way to run that technique on the Series S, regardless of the effort they have to expend or compromises that they have to make. So it's best to assume that games that heavily make use of ray tracing, including RTGI, will probably retain at least some of those effects on Series S, even if that means big cutbacks elsewhere. The Xbox Series S is a ray tracing capable console that has a mediocre track record in existing software. But there are excellent ray trace titles available on the hardware, and the most ambitious uses of ray tracing on the console are still to come. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.